Victoria never thought a car accident would change her entire life. But when his Ferrari slammed into her old Honda, everything she believed about rich people was about to be shattered. Victoria's hands were shaking as she got out of her car. The damage looked expensive, and she knew she couldn't afford to fix it. Victoria expected him to yell, to demand money, to call his lawyer. Instead, he did something that left her speechless. He pulled out a leather notebook and started writing something. Not insurance information, something else entirely. Then he made a phone call. Victoria couldn't hear what he said, but his voice was urgent, almost excited. When he walked back to Victoria, he had a white envelope in his hand. Her heart was racing. "This is for you," he said simply. Victoria stared at the envelope, completely bewildered. "But why?" He just smiled mysteriously. "You'll understand soon enough." Then he walked away, leaving Victoria standing there with more questions than answers. Victoria sat in her damaged car, staring at that envelope. What kind of rich man gives something to the person who just crashed into his Ferrari? As Victoria drove home in her barely functioning car, she couldn't stop thinking about his strange behavior. The envelope seemed to burn a hole in Victoria's mind. What could possibly be inside? When Victoria got home to her small apartment, she still hadn't opened it. She was too afraid of what she might find. Part of Victoria wanted to throw it away. Rich people don't just give gifts to strangers. There had to be a catch. But something about his eyes told her this wasn't ordinary. There was kindness there, mixed with something she couldn't identify. Victoria placed the envelope on her coffee table and stared at it. "Tomorrow I'll open it. Tonight, I need to process what happened." Victoria stared at her reflection, wondering if this day really happened. Did a millionaire really just change my life forever? That night, Victoria couldn't sleep. His mysterious smile kept replaying in her mind. What was he planning? Every time Victoria closed her eyes, she saw his face. There was something different about him, something that made her heart race. Victoria got up twice to look at the envelope, but each time she pulled back. What if it changed everything? The next morning, Victoria got ready for work with one burning question. Would she see him again? Before we continue this incredible story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below, hit that like button if you're already hooked, and subscribe for more amazing stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Victoria sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the white envelope over her morning coffee. She had barely slept, tossing and turning all night, wondering what secrets it contained. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it, the memory of that mysterious man's intense blue eyes haunting her thoughts. "What could he possibly know about me?" she whispered to herself. The envelope felt heavier than it should, as if it contained more than just paper. Taking a deep breath, Victoria knew there was no turning back. Whatever was inside would change everything, though she couldn't imagine how. With trembling fingers, Victoria carefully tore open the envelope. The paper inside was expensive, cream-colored with a subtle watermark she'd never seen before. As she unfolded it, elegant masculine handwriting came into view, written with what appeared to be a fountain pen. The words were precise, carefully chosen, and as Victoria began to read, her heart started racing. This wasn't just a random note. This was something that would shatter everything she thought she knew about yesterday's accident. Her coffee grew cold as she absorbed each shocking word, her world tilting on its axis with each revelation. The note contained information that made Victoria's blood run cold. Details about her mother Helen's condition, her work schedule, even personal struggles she'd never shared with anyone. How could a stranger know all this? She gasped, her voice barely a whisper. But what disturbed her most wasn't just what he knew. It was what he didn't reveal about himself or his intentions. The note was signed with only initials, leaving her with more questions than answers. "Who are you really?" she whispered to the empty kitchen. The level of detail suggested this wasn't random, but his motives remained completely mysterious. Victoria dropped the note as if it burned her fingers, her chair scraping against the floor as she stood abruptly. "What does he want from me?" she whispered, her mind racing with possibilities. The information was too precise, too personal for a coincidence. Yet the note gave no indication of what came next or why he'd chosen to share this knowledge with her. She paced around her small kitchen, running her hands through her hair, trying to make sense of the cryptic message. Was this some kind of warning? A threat? Or something else entirely? The uncertainty was driving her crazy. Despite her racing thoughts, Victoria still had to go to work. She couldn't afford to miss a shift, especially with her mother's medical bills mounting. As she put on her nurse scrubs, her hands still trembled from the shock of the note. "I need to focus on my patients," she told herself, trying to push away the disturbing thoughts about the mysterious stranger. But as she grabbed her keys and headed for the door, Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The note had been carefully crafted to unsettle her, and she had no idea what would come next. Victoria arrived at Metropolitan General Hospital trying to appear normal, but her colleagues immediately noticed something was wrong. The usually cheerful nurse seemed distant and preoccupied as she clocked in for her morning shift. "You okay, Victoria?" asked Janet, her closest friend at work. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Victoria forced a smile, not ready to explain about the mysterious man or the disturbing note. "Just tired," she lied, knowing she couldn't tell anyone about what happened without sounding completely insane. How could she explain that a stranger seemed to know everything about her private life? As Victoria made her rounds checking on patients, she couldn't shake the paranoid feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow seemed suspicious. Every unfamiliar face made her heart race. The hospital, which had always been her sanctuary, now felt exposed and vulnerable. "Get it together," she whispered to herself as she entered room 302 to check on Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman recovering from surgery. But even as she took vital signs and offered comfort to her patients, Victoria's mind kept drifting back to that mysterious note and its impossible revelations about her private life. Victoria was adjusting Mrs. Rodriguez's for when she heard excited whispers in the hallway. "Did you see him?" one voice said. "He's incredibly handsome, and that suit must cost more than I make in a month." Victoria's blood ran cold, her hands freezing mid-motion. She tried to focus on her patient, but her heart was pounding with dread. "Nurse Victoria, you're trembling," Mrs. Rodriguez observed with concern. "Are you feeling all right, dear?" Victoria managed a weak smile, but inside, panic was building. She had a terrible feeling she knew exactly who was causing all the excitement in the hospital corridors today. Victoria approached the nurse's station where a group of her colleagues had gathered, their voices filled with excitement and curiosity. "I've never seen anyone like him," whispered Sarah, one of the younger nurses. "He just walked in like he owned the place, asking to speak with administration." The security guards practically fell over themselves escorting him. Victoria felt her knees go weak. The description matched her mysterious stranger perfectly, but she still had no idea who he really was or what kind of power he wielded. "Did anyone catch his name?" she asked, trying to sound casual while her heart hammered at her chest. Victoria's worst fears were confirmed when she spotted him at the end of the hallway, dressed in an impeccable navy suit, speaking with Dr. Harrison, the hospital administrator. The mysterious man from yesterday looked even more commanding in the sterile hospital environment, his presence somehow making everyone around him seem smaller. Their eyes met across the bustling hallway, and that same enigmatic smile crossed his lips. Victoria felt trapped, like prey caught in a predator's gaze. He had come here for her. She was certain of it. But his true identity and intentions remained as mysterious as ever, and that terrified her more than anything. Days passed, and Victoria tried to convince herself that the mysterious encounter was just a strange coincidence. But as she walked to her old Honda after another exhausting double shift, she spotted a familiar figure leaning against an expensive car in the hospital parking garage. Her heart skipped a beat when she realized it was him, the man from the accident. "How does he know when I get off work?" she wondered, her steps slowing as she approached her car. He wasn't approaching her directly, just observing from a distance, but his presence felt intentional. Victoria fumbled with her keys, acutely aware that he was watching her struggle with her car door that always stuck. The next day, during her brief break between her hospital shift and her evening job at the clinic, Victoria sat alone in the cafeteria with a simple sandwich. She worked 16-hour days just to make ends meet, rushing from Metropolitan General to the community clinic across town. Her mother Helen's cancer treatments were draining their savings faster than she could earn money. "I can't keep this pace up much longer," she whispered to herself, rubbing her tired eyes. She had no idea that someone had been quietly observing her relentless schedule, taking note of her dedication and sacrifice. The mysterious man from the accident had somehow learned about her double life, her struggles, her unwavering commitment to her mother's care. That evening at the community clinic where Victoria worked her second job, she was checking in patients when she noticed an unusual visitor. He sat quietly in the corner of the waiting room, not seeming sick or injured, just observing. When their eyes met, he didn't look away or seem embarrassed about being caught. Instead, he offered a small nod of acknowledgement. Victoria's heart began racing, but she forced herself to maintain professional composure. "Sir, do you need medical attention?" she asked, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. His response surprised her with its gentleness. "I'm just impressed by your dedication. Working 2 jobs can't be easy." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. During her short break, Victoria found him waiting in the small break room with 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this," he said, pushing 1 cup toward her. Against her better judgment, Victoria sat down across from him. "Why are you following me?" she asked directly, but without the fear she'd felt initially. "I'm not following you," he replied calmly. "I'm trying to understand you. There's something remarkable about someone who works this hard for someone they love." His words touched something deep inside Victoria, and despite her wariness, she found herself curious about this mysterious man who seemed to see her dedication rather than just her struggles. "You still haven't told me your name," Victoria said, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee cup. "And you still haven't explained how you know so much about my life." He was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "My name is complicated, but what matters is that I recognize something in you that most people overlook." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "You give everything you have to help others, but you never ask for help yourself. That's rare." Victoria felt her defensive walls beginning to lower slightly. "Maybe because I've learned that help always comes with strings attached." His expression grew thoughtful. "Not always. Tell me about your mother," he said gently, and Victoria was surprised by how much she wanted to share. "Helen is the strongest woman I know," she began, her voice softening with love. "She raised me alone after my father left, worked 3 jobs to put me through nursing school, and never complained once. Now that she needs me, there's no question that I'll do whatever it takes." He listened without interrupting, his attention completely focused on her words. "She sounds incredible," he said quietly. "She must be very proud of you." Victoria felt tears threatening. "I just wish I could do more. The treatments are so expensive, and I'm afraid." She stopped, surprised by how easy it was to talk to this stranger. "I lost my father when I was young, too," he said unexpectedly, his voice carrying old pain. "But I wasn't lucky enough to have someone like your mother. I had wealth, privilege, but no one who truly cared about my well-being." Victoria studied his face, seeing vulnerability she hadn't expected. "Money doesn't fix everything," she said softly, and he nodded with obvious relief at her understanding. "Exactly. That's why I'm meeting someone like you, someone who gives so selflessly. It makes me want to be better." Victoria felt her heart flutter at his words. Despite her caution, she was beginning to see this mysterious man as more than just a threat to her privacy. "What do you do?" Victoria asked, genuinely curious now, "besides mysteriously appearing in people's lives?" He chuckled, and the sound was warm and genuine. "I run a business, but honestly, it often feels meaningless. Numbers on papers, profit margins, board meetings. Nothing that actually helps people." Victoria leaned forward, interested. "But business can help people. Create jobs, support communities." His eyes lit up at her words. "I've never thought of it that way. You see potential where others see problems, don't you?" Victoria blushed slightly. I guess I have to. In nursing, every patient is a puzzle to solve, a person to help heal. Their conversation was flowing naturally now, and Victoria realized she was enjoying talking to him. I have a confession, he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. I didn't just happen to find you here tonight. I've been trying to understand who you are, what drives you. Victoria tensed slightly, but he continued quickly. Not to harm you or invade your privacy maliciously, but because after our accident, I couldn't stop thinking about your strength, your dignity in that moment. Victoria felt her cheeks warm. I was terrified and probably looked like a mess. He shook his head firmly. You look like someone who faces life's challenges head-on, without asking for pity or making excuses. That's incredibly attractive. The word attractive hung in the air between them, changing the dynamic of their conversation. Victoria looked into his eyes, seeing something she hadn't expected, genuine admiration mixed with something deeper. I still don't understand what you want from me, she said quietly, or why someone like you would be interested in someone like me. He reached across the small table, not quite touching her hand, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Someone like me has everything money can buy, but nothing that money can't buy. Someone like you has the kind of heart and character that can't be purchased. Victoria felt her breath catch. Despite all her reservations, despite the mystery surrounding him, she was beginning to feel drawn to this enigmatic man who seemed to see her soul. Over the following days, their conversations had grown more comfortable, but tonight Alexander's demeanor was different. He approached Victoria as she walked home from her evening shift, his expression serious and urgent. Victoria, we need to talk, he said, falling in a step beside her. I know about your mother's latest test results. Victoria stopped dead in her tracks, her blood running cold. How could you possibly know about that? We just got those results this afternoon. The violation of her privacy hit her like a physical blow. Have you been spying on us? Going through our medical records? Her voice was rising with each word, anger replacing the trust they'd been building. Victoria, please let me explain, Alexander said, reaching out toward her, but she stepped back sharply. Explain what? How you've been investigating my family's private medical information. How you've been stalking us. Her voice cracked with emotion. The cancer has spread, hasn't it? The doctors want to try an experimental treatment that costs more than I'll ever have. Alexander nodded gravely. $300,000, not covered by insurance. I know because I want to pay for it. Victoria stared at him in disbelief, her anger reaching a boiling point. You want to what? She hissed. You think you can just waltz into our lives and throw money at our problems? I'm trying to help you, Alexander said, his voice strained. Your mother could die without this treatment. Victoria's eyes flashed with fury. Don't you dare use my mother's condition to justify your sick need to play God with people's lives. She was practically shouting now, months of stress and fear pouring out in rage. You think because you have money, you can just buy your way into our tragedy? Make us your charity case. Alexander stepped back, clearly stung by her words. That's not what this is, he protested. You don't know me well enough to make that judgment. Victoria laughed bitterly. I don't know you at all. You won't even tell me your real name. You want to know who I am? Alexander's voice rose to match hers, his usual calm composure cracking. I'm someone who has watched people suffer while others who could help just look the other way. I'm someone who has more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes while good people like you work themselves to death. Victoria was taken aback by his sudden passion. So this is about your guilt? You need to feel better about yourself? She shot back. I won't be your redemption project. Alexander ran his hands through his hair in frustration. This isn't about me. This is about you. About someone finally deserving the help they're too proud to ask for. The raw emotion in his voice made Victoria falter slightly. Too proud. Victoria's voice broke with emotion. You think this is about pride? This is about dignity. About not being reduced to a sob story that makes some rich man feel important. Tears were streaming down her face now, but her voice remained strong. I work 2 jobs, Alexander. I sacrifice everything for my mother because that's what love looks like. Not writing checks to strangers. Alexander's expression softened as he saw her pain. Victoria, I never meant to insult you. Your strength, your dedication, it's not a weakness I'm trying to fix. It's exactly why I want to help. His voice gentled. You're not a charity case. You're the most remarkable woman I've ever met. Don't you see? Alexander continued, his voice filled with desperate sincerity. I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who only want what I can give them. Money, connections, status. But you work yourself to exhaustion rather than ask for help. You face impossible odds with grace and determination. Victoria's anger was beginning to shift as she heard the admiration in his voice. That's not remarkable, she whispered. That's just survival. Alexander shook his head firmly. No, that's love. Pure, selfless love. And it's taught me what I've been missing my whole life. The sincerity in his eyes made Victoria's heart flutter despite her anger. Victoria wiped her tears, studying Alexander's face for any sign of deception. Why does this matter so much to you? She asked quietly. You could help thousands of people. Why me? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, seeming to gather courage. Because when I look at you, I see everything I want to be, but never learn how to become. You give everything and ask for nothing. You love without condition, fight without surrender. His voice grew softer, and because somewhere along the way, I started falling in love with who you are. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. The words hung between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. You don't even know me, Victoria protested weakly, but her anger had completely dissolved. I know enough, Alexander replied, stepping closer. I know you sing to your mother during her treatments because it calms her anxiety. I know you give your lunch to homeless patients who can't afford food. I know you work 16-hour days without complaint because someone you love depends on you. Victoria stared at him in amazement. How do you know all that? He smiled sadly. Because I've been trying to understand what makes someone so selfless. I've been looking for someone like you my entire life, Victoria. Someone real. Victoria felt her defenses crumbling as she saw the genuine emotion in Alexander's eyes. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. Scared of needing you. Scared of what happens when you realize I'm not as special as you think I am. Alexander caught her hand gently. And I'm scared of losing you before you even give me a chance, he replied. Scared that my world will destroy whatever we're building here. Victoria looked at their joined hands, feeling the warmth of his touch. What are we building, Alexander? She asked softly. I don't even know what to call this. He squeezed her hand gently. Maybe we don't need to name it yet. Maybe we just need to trust it. Alexander lifted his free hand to gently touch Victoria's face, wiping away the last of her tears. Let me help your mother, he said quietly. Not because you need charity, but because I need to know that someone as good as you exists in this world. Because losing you would be unbearable. Victoria felt herself leaning into his touch, her heart overriding her rational mind. If I say yes, she whispered, everything changes between us. Alexander nodded, his thumb tracing her cheek softly. Everything already has changed, Victoria. The moment I met you, my world shifted. She closed her eyes, feeling the truth of his words in her heart. When she opened them again, she saw her own feelings reflected in his blue eyes. Victoria finally accepted Alexander's invitation to dinner, choosing a small Italian restaurant in her neighborhood that she knew he would find simple compared to his usual world. As they walked toward the entrance together, she felt nervous but also excited about spending real time with him outside of their intense conversations. I hope this place is okay, she said, suddenly self-conscious about her choice. I know it's not fancy, but the food is authentic and the owner, Mrs. Romano, treats everyone like family. Alexander smiled warmly as he held the door open for her. It's perfect. I'd rather be somewhere that means something to you than somewhere designed to impress strangers. His response eased her anxiety, and Victoria felt herself beginning to relax. The restaurant was exactly as Victoria had described, small, warm, and filled with the aroma of garlic and herbs. Mrs. Romano, a woman in her 60s with flour-dusted hands, approached their table with genuine enthusiasm. Victoria, mia cara. You brought a friend. She beamed at Alexander with the kind of immediate acceptance that only came from places where everyone was treated as family. Alexander stood respectfully as she approached, and Victoria watched in amazement as he charmed the older woman effortlessly, asking about her recipes and complimenting the restaurant's atmosphere. He's not what I expected from someone wealthy, Victoria thought, watching him interact with Mrs. Romano as if she were the most important person in the world. As they shared a plate of Mrs. Romano's famous lasagna, Victoria found herself genuinely enjoying Alexander's company for the first time without the weight of mystery and tension between them. He told her stories about his travels, but not in a boastful way, instead focusing on the people he'd met and the lessons he'd learned. I spent a month in a small village in Tuscany once, he said, twirling pasta around his fork with surprising skill. The people there had almost nothing by material standards, but they were happier than anyone I'd ever met. They taught me that wealth isn't about what you own, it's about what you share. Victoria felt her heart warming to this side of him. Thoughtful, humble, genuinely interested in understanding the world beyond his privileged bubble. Tell me about nursing school, Alexander said, genuinely interested. What made you choose healthcare? Victoria's face lit up as she shared her passion. I was 7 when my grandmother had a stroke. I watched the nurses caring for her with such gentleness and skill, and I knew that's what I wanted to do. Be there for people during their most vulnerable moments. Alexander listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about her training, her most memorable patients, her hopes for the future. Victoria was surprised by how much she enjoyed talking to someone who truly listened. Most people hear nurse and think it's just changing bedpans and giving shots, she said. But you understand that it's about healing souls as much as bodies. Alexander nodded, because you see the whole person, not just the problem. As the evening progressed, Alexander opened up about his own struggles in ways Victoria hadn't expected. I lost my father when I was 12, he said quietly, his usual confidence replaced by vulnerability. Not to death, but to his obsession with building an empire. He became so focused on success that he forgot how to be human. Victoria reached across the table to touch his hand gently. That must have been devastating for a child. Alexander nodded, his eyes distant with old pain. I promised myself I'd never become like him, but somewhere along the way I did. Until I met you. He looked at her with such intensity that Victoria felt her breath catch. You reminded me what it feels like to care about something real. After dinner, they walked slowly through Victoria's neighborhood, neither wanting the evening to end. The streets were quiet, lined with modest houses where families were settling in for the night. This is so different from my world, Alexander said, but there was no condescension in his voice, only wonder. Everyone here seems to actually know their neighbors. Victoria smiled. Mrs. Chun brings soup when someone's sick, Mr. Rodriguez helps fix cars, and during holidays, the whole block comes together. We may not have much money, but we have community. Alexander was quiet for a moment, processing this. I live in a building where I don't even know the names of people I see every day, he admitted. Wealth creates isolation, even when you don't want it to. They found a small park with a bench overlooking a playground where children had played earlier in the day. Sitting together in the peaceful evening air, Victoria felt more connected to Alexander than she had to anyone in years. What do you dream about? He asked suddenly. Not your goals or plans, but what makes your heart happy when you imagine it? Victoria considered the question seriously. I dream about my mother being healthy again, about having enough time to really talk to my patients instead of rushing between rooms, about maybe having a family someday, children who grow up knowing they're loved unconditionally. She looked at him curiously. What about you? What do you dream about when no one's watching? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, as if he'd never been asked that question before. I dream about using my resources for something meaningful, about being remembered for what I gave rather than what I accumulated. He turned to look at Victoria, his eyes reflecting the streetlight above them. And lately, I dream about having someone to share it all with. Someone who understands that real wealth isn't about money, but about connection, purpose, love. Victoria felt her heart racing at the implications of his words. Someone like me? She asked softly. Alexander nodded, his hand finding hers on the bench between them. Exactly like you. Someone who makes me want to be the man I always hoped I could become. I'm scared, Victoria admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Scared that this is too good to be true, that I'll wake up and find out this was all some elaborate game. Alexander lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I'm scared too, he confessed. Scared that I'll somehow hurt you just by being part of your life. My world can be dangerous, Victoria. People get hurt when they get close to me. Victoria studied his face, seeing the genuine fear and pain there. Then why are you here? Why risk it? Alexander's answer was immediate and certain. Because for the first time in my life, I've found something worth risking everything for. You're worth risking everything for. The space between them seemed to disappear as Victoria felt herself drawn to Alexander's honesty and vulnerability. I don't know what happens next, she whispered, her eyes searching his face. But I know I don't want this feeling to end. Alexander cupped her face gently in his hands, his thumb tracing her cheek softly. Then don't let it end, he said quietly. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. As he leaned toward her, Victoria felt all her fears and doubts melting away. Their first kiss was gentle, tender, filled with all the emotion they'd been building toward throughout the evening. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing heavily, and Victoria knew that everything had changed between them forever. In that moment, under the streetlight in her simple neighborhood park, she felt like the richest woman in the world. Over the following weeks, Victoria and Alexander's relationship blossomed in secret, away from the prying eyes of his world and the judgment she feared from hers. They would meet after her shifts, taking long walks through her neighborhood or sharing quiet dinners at small cafes where no one would recognize him. Victoria had never felt happier, but she also couldn't shake the feeling that they were living in a bubble that would eventually burst. I love these moments with you, Alexander said, as they strolled past houses where families were gathering for dinner. Everything feels so real, so genuine. I never want to go back to my other life. Victoria squeezed his hand, understanding exactly what he meant, but also knowing that eventually their two worlds would have to collide. Tonight was different. Alexander had asked to meet Victoria's mother, and despite her anxiety about the meeting, Victoria knew it was time. As they approached her apartment building, Alexander carried a simple bouquet of Helen's favorite flowers, daisies, which he'd somehow learned she loved. Are you sure you're ready for this? Victoria asked, noticing his nervous energy. My mother can be protective and very direct with her questions. Alexander smiled, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. I want to meet the woman who raised someone as incredible as you, he said. Besides, if I'm going to be part of your life, I need her approval more than anyone else's. Victoria felt her heart flutter at his words, the casual way he spoke about being part of her life permanently. Helen was waiting in the living room when they arrived, and Victoria immediately noticed how her mother's eyes assessed Alexander with the sharp intelligence that illness hadn't dimmed. Mom, this is Alexander, Victoria said, her voice carrying both pride and nervousness. Alexander, this is my mother, Helen. Alexander approached Helen with genuine respect, offering the daisies with a warm smile. Mrs. Matthews, it's an honor to meet you. Victoria talks about you constantly, and I can see where she gets her strength and grace. Helen accepted the flowers with a knowing smile, but her eyes never left his face. So you're the mysterious man who's been making my daughter glow like a teenager, she said with typical directness. Sit down, Alexander. Let's talk. Alexander settled into the chair across from Helen, and Victoria watched anxiously as her mother began what she knew would be a thorough evaluation. Victoria tells me you've been very generous with medical expenses, Helen said, her tone neutral but probing. That's quite an investment in someone you've just met. Alexander met her direct gaze without flinching. With respect, Mrs. Matthews, I didn't do it as an investment. I did it because I care about your daughter, and your well-being is essential to her happiness. Helen studied him for a long moment. And what makes you think a man with your obvious wealth has anything real to offer a woman like my Victoria? The question was blunt, But Alexander seemed to appreciate her honesty. Honestly, I'm not sure I do have anything real to offer her, Alexander admitted, surprising both Victoria and Helen with his vulnerability. Your daughter has taught me what genuine love and sacrifice look like. She's shown me that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the depth of care we show for others. Helen's expression softened slightly, but her protective instincts remained sharp. Pretty words, young man. But Victoria has been hurt before by people who promised more than they could deliver. Alexander leaned forward, his voice filled with quiet conviction. I would rather lose everything I owned than cause Victoria a moment of pain. She's changed my life in ways I'm still discovering, and I want to spend the rest of my days proving myself worthy of the love she's given me. As the evening progressed and Helen prepared a simple dinner, Victoria watched in amazement as Alexander seamlessly integrated into their modest family dynamic. He insisted on helping with dishes, asked Helen about her treatment progress with genuine concern, and shared stories about his own childhood that revealed his loneliness and longing for exactly this kind of family warmth. You know what I love most about your daughter? He said to Helen as they cleared the table together. She never asks for anything, but she gives everything. She works herself to exhaustion to take care of you, and she never complains, never asks for recognition. That kind of love is rarer than any treasure. Helen glanced at Victoria with approval in her eyes. After dinner, as they sat in the small living room sharing coffee and Helen's homemade cookies, Victoria felt a contentment she hadn't experienced since before her mother's diagnosis. Alexander fit into their world so naturally, asking Helen about her favorite books, listening to stories about Victoria's childhood, and sharing his own hopes for the future. I have a confession, Helen said suddenly, looking directly at Alexander. I was prepared to dislike you. Rich men who sweep in to save struggling families usually have ulterior motives. Alexander nodded, understanding her caution completely. And now, he asked gently. Helen smiled, the first truly warm smile she'd given him all evening. Now I think my daughter might have found someone who sees her the way she deserves to be seen. As the evening came to an end, Helen pulled Alexander aside while Victoria gathered their coats. I'm going to give you some advice, she said quietly, her voice carrying the wisdom of a mother who had watched her daughter sacrifice everything for love. Victoria has never put herself first in her entire life. She needs someone who will treasure that selflessness while also encouraging her to accept love in return. Alexander listened intently, recognizing the gift of trust Helen was offering. She's the most remarkable woman I've ever met, he replied. I want to spend my life making sure she knows that. Helen nodded approvingly. Good, because if you ever hurt her, you'll have me to answer to, and cancer hasn't made me any less protective. Outside the apartment building, Victoria felt overwhelmed with emotion as she realized how perfectly Alexander had connected with her mother. She likes you, she said, hardly believing it herself. I've never seen her approve of anyone I've dated so quickly. Alexander pulled her into his arms, relief and joy evident in his expression. She's incredible, Victoria. I could see exactly where you get your strength, your compassion, your ability to love so deeply. Victoria felt tears of happiness threatening as she looked up at him. You were perfect with her. Natural, genuine, respectful. You didn't try to impress her with your wealth or charm your way past her defenses. Alexander cupped her face gently. I didn't want to impress her. I wanted her to trust me with the most precious thing in her world. I love you, Alexander said suddenly, the words spilling out with raw honesty. I know it's soon. I know our situation is complicated, but I can't pretend anymore. I love everything about you, your strength, your kindness, the way you light up when you talk about helping people. I love how you've made me want to be better than I ever thought possible. Victoria felt her heart soar as she heard the words she'd been hoping for, but afraid to expect. I love you too, she whispered, standing on her toes to kiss him softly. I love how you see the best in everyone, how you've embraced my simple world, how you make me feel like I deserve something beautiful. As they held each other under the streetlight, both knew that their love was real, deep, and worth fighting for, no matter what challenges lay ahead in their different worlds. Margaret Whitmore had built her reputation on knowing everything that happened in her son's life. So when the private investigator she'd hired delivered photographs of Alexander with an unknown woman, her blood ran cold. The images showed her son, heir to a billion-dollar empire, holding hands with a common hospital worker, kissing her under streetlights like some romantic fool. "This is unacceptable," she whispered to herself, studying each photo with growing disgust. Margaret had spent decades carefully curating Alexander's social circle, ensuring he would eventually marry someone from their world, someone who could enhance the family's power and prestige. This nobody from the wrong side of town threatened everything she had built. Within hours, Margaret was making phone calls to every contact in her extensive network, gathering intelligence on this threat to her family's legacy. Victoria Matthews, 28, hospital nurse, supports sick mother, she muttered, reviewing the file her investigator had compiled. The girl's background was disappointingly clean. No scandals, no obvious weaknesses to exploit. But Margaret had eliminated obstacles before, and this gold-digging nurse would be no different. "Alexander has always been too soft-hearted for his own good," she said to herself. "It's time I reminded him of his responsibilities to this family." She picked up her phone to arrange a meeting with her son. Alexander arrived at his mother's summons, expecting their usual monthly dinner, but sensing something different in her tone when she called. Margaret sat at the head of the table in the private dining room of their family's club, her posture regal and intimidating. "Mother, you sounded urgent on the phone," Alexander said, kissing her cheek politely before taking his seat. "Is everything all right?" Margaret smiled coldly, producing a manila envelope from her purse. "Everything is very far from all right, Alexander. We need to discuss your recent romantic entanglements." Alexander's blood ran cold as he recognized the tone she used when she was about to declare war on something that threatened the family's interests. Margaret spread the photographs across the white tablecloth with surgical precision, each image showing Alexander and Victoria in intimate moments they believed were private. "Explain to me," Margaret said, her voice deadly calm, "why the heir to the Whitmore fortune is consorting with a hospital janitor." Alexander's face flushed with rage as he saw the invasion of their privacy laid out before him. "She's a nurse, not a janitor. And how dare you have me followed?" Margaret waved his protests away dismissively. "I dare because it's my job to protect this family from threats, and this woman represents a significant threat to everything we've built." Alexander stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "Victoria is not a threat," Alexander shouted, his usual composure completely shattered. "She's the most genuine, caring person I've ever met, and I love her." Margaret's laugh was like ice cracking. "Love? You think you love this fortune hunter who's clearly using you for your wealth?" Alexander slammed his fist on the table, making the crystal glasses ring. "She doesn't even know the extent of my wealth. She's refused every expensive gift I've tried to give her." Margaret stood slowly, her height and presence suddenly menacing. "Then she's smarter than most gold diggers. But the result is the same. She doesn't belong in our world, and I will not allow this family's reputation to be destroyed by your infatuation with a nobody." "You will end this relationship immediately," Margaret commanded, her voice brooking no argument. "I've already arranged for a suitable settlement to make the girl disappear quietly." Alexander stared at his mother in horror. "A settlement? You're talking about buying off the woman I love?" Margaret's expression remained arctic. "I'm talking about protecting our family's legacy from a calculated attack by a woman who has nothing to lose and everything to gain." Alexander backed away from the table, disgust written clearly across his face. "I can't believe you've already arranged to pay her off without even meeting her." Margaret smiled coldly. "Oh, I intend to meet her. Tomorrow, in fact. I've already arranged the meeting." "You will not go anywhere near Victoria," Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm warning you, Mother. Stay away from her." Margaret laughed, the sound echoing off the dining room's marble walls. "You're warning me? Alexander, darling, you seem to have forgotten who controls the family fortune. who sits on the board of directors, who has the power to cut off your access to everything you've ever known. Alexander felt the familiar trap closing around him, the golden chains his mother had always used to control his life. "This is different," he said quietly. "Victoria is different. I won't let you destroy her the way you've destroyed everything else I've ever cared about." The next day, despite Alexander's warnings, Margaret proceeded with her plan. She had summoned Victoria to meet her at the city's most exclusive hotel, deliberately choosing an environment where the girl would feel out of place and intimidated. When Victoria arrived, clearly uncomfortable in her simple dress among the luxury and elegance, Margaret felt a surge of satisfaction. "Miss Matthews," Margaret said coolly as Victoria approached. "Thank you for coming. Please sit down." Victoria's face was pale but determined as she took the offered seat. "Mrs. Whitmore, Alexander told me you wanted to meet me, though he seemed very upset about it." Margaret's smile was predatory. "My son has always been too emotional for his own good." Without preamble, Margaret placed a thick envelope on the table between them. Inside this envelope is a check for $5 million. More money than you could earn in several lifetimes of nursing. "All you have to do is disappear from my son's life permanently." Victoria stared at the envelope in disbelief, her face cycling through shock, hurt, and finally anger. "You're trying to buy me off," she said, her voice barely steady. "Does Alexander know you're doing this?" Margaret's smile was cold. "Alexander doesn't need to know about our little arrangement. He'll get over his infatuation soon enough when you're gone." Victoria's hands trembled as the full implications hit her. Did he know you were planning this? Is this what he wants, but he's too cowardly to tell me himself? Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor, tears threatening to spill down her cheeks. "I need to know," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I need to know if Alexander put you up to this, if he's been lying to me about everything." Margaret sensed victory and pressed her advantage. "My dear child, wealthy men like my son don't marry nurses from the wrong side of town. They have their fun, and then they move on to someone appropriate. Surely you must know that." Victoria felt her world crashing down around her as doubt flooded her mind. Everything Alexander had said about love, about wanting a future together, suddenly seemed like lies designed to keep her compliant while he enjoyed their affair. "Keep your money," Victoria whispered, walking toward the exit. "But you've given me something much more valuable, the truth about what I really mean to your son." Victoria's world came crashing down when she arrived at work to find a tabloid newspaper spread across the break room table, with her photo splashed across the front page. "Billionaire's secret romance with hospital nurse," screamed the headline, alongside grainy photographs of her and Alexander kissing outside her apartment building. Her hands trembled as she read the article, describing her as a gold-digging opportunist and Alexander as slumming with the help. "I'm so sorry, Victoria," Janet whispered, trying to pull the paper away. "Someone left this here before the morning shift." Victoria felt sick as she realized that their private moments had been captured, dissected, and served up as entertainment for the public. Her fairy tale romance had become a media spectacle overnight. As Victoria tried to begin her shift, she became aware of the divided atmosphere among her colleagues. Some nurses looked at her with sympathy and support, while others whispered behind their hands with obvious judgment. "I can't believe she was hiding this from us," she overheard Sarah saying to a group near the nurses' station. "Dating a billionaire while complaining about money problems? That's so fake." But Janet quickly defended her. "Victoria's not like that. She's the most honest person here." Victoria felt caught between gratitude for her supporters and shame that she'd become the center of hospital gossip. The unity of her workplace had been shattered by forces beyond her control. Even her patients had seen the story. Mrs. Rodriguez held up the tabloid with an apologetic expression when Victoria entered to check her vitals. "Mija, is this really you in these pictures?" she asked gently. Victoria felt her cheeks burning with embarrassment as she nodded. "I'm sorry you had to see that, Mrs. Rodriguez. It's not. It's more complicated than they're making it seem." The elderly woman patted Victoria's hand kindly. Don't you worry about what strangers think, dear. But tell me, does this man make you happy? Victoria's eyes filled with tears as she realized she didn't know how to answer that question anymore. The happiness she'd felt with Alexander now seemed tainted by the public humiliation and family opposition. By noon, Victoria had been called into the administrator's office. Dr. Harrison sat behind his desk, looking uncomfortable but determined. "Victoria, I need to discuss the media attention you brought to the hospital," he said carefully. "We've had reporters calling all morning asking for comments about your relationship." Victoria felt her stomach drop. "Dr. Harrison, I never wanted any of this publicity. I had no idea the story would leak." He nodded sympathetically. "I believe you, but I have to consider the hospital's reputation. Some board members are concerned about the disruption this could cause." Victoria realized with growing horror that her job, the career she'd worked so hard to build, was now in jeopardy because of her relationship with Alexander. After her shift, Victoria found Alexander waiting in the parking garage, his expensive car surrounded by news vans that had followed him there. "Victoria, thank God," he said, rushing toward her. "I've been trying to reach you all day. I'm handling this. I've got my lawyers working to stop the story from spreading further." Victoria looked at the media circus surrounding them and felt overwhelmed. "It's too late, Alexander. The damage is done. My job is in jeopardy. Patients are asking me about tabloid stories, and half my colleagues think I'm a fraud." Alexander reached for her hands. "I'll fix this. I'll make sure your job is protected. I'll buy the damn hospital if I have to." His words only made Victoria feel worse about the impossible gulf between their worlds. "Don't you see?" Victoria said, stepping back as camera flashes went off around them. "This is exactly the problem. You think money can solve everything, but it can't undo the humiliation I've already suffered. It can't erase the fact that my private life is now public entertainment." Alexander looked stricken as he realized the photographers were capturing their argument. "Victoria, please, let me take you somewhere private where we can talk." But Victoria shook her head. "I can't do this anymore, Alexander. I need space to think, to figure out how to rebuild what's been destroyed." The pain in her voice was evident even over the shouting of reporters trying to get quotes. As Victoria tried to get to her car, reporters shoved microphones in her face, shouting questions about her relationship, her intentions, whether she was after Alexander's money. "No comment," she kept repeating, but the aggressive questioning made her feel like a criminal. Alexander tried to shield her from the cameras, but his presence only made them more aggressive. "Victoria, is it true you're pregnant with his baby?" one reporter shouted. "How much money has he given your family?" screamed another. Victoria felt trapped and humiliated as she finally reached her car, Alexander standing helplessly by his luxury vehicle as the media circus swirled around them both. The contrast between their situations had never been more stark or painful. That evening, Victoria sat with her mother watching the news coverage of their relationship, feeling sick as reporters speculated about her motives and Alexander's judgment. Local nurse Victoria Matthews has been secretly dating billionaire Alexander Whitmore for several weeks. The anchor reported over images of Victoria leaving the hospital looking harassed. Sources close to the Whitmore family say they're concerned about gold-digging opportunists targeting their heir. Helen turned off the television angrily. "Those vultures," she said. "They're making you sound like some kind of criminal." Victoria buried her face in her hands. Maybe his mother was right. Maybe people like us don't belong in that world. "Victoria, look at me," Helen said firmly, taking her daughter's hands. "I've watched you with Alexander. I've seen how he looks at you, how he treats you. That man loves you genuinely." Victoria shook her head sadly. "But look at the cost, Mom. My career is in jeopardy, my privacy is gone, and I'm being portrayed as a villain in the media. Maybe it's better for both of us if I just walk away." Helen's eyes filled with concern. "Don't let fear make this decision for you. Don't let cruel people destroy something beautiful just because they're jealous or threatened." But Victoria felt too overwhelmed by the public scrutiny and professional consequences to believe that love could overcome such obstacles. Late that night, Victoria lay in bed listening to news vans idling outside her apartment building while her phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, concerned friends, and Alexander. She'd stopped answering hours ago, but the messages kept coming. Alexander's texts grew more desperate as the night progressed. "Please talk to me. We can get through this together. Don't let them win by driving us apart. I love you more than anything in this world." Victoria turned her phone off and pulled the covers over her head, but she couldn't escape the crushing realization that maybe Margaret Whitmore had been right. Maybe the gulf between their worlds was simply too wide to bridge, and maybe trying to cross it would only destroy them both in the process. 3 days of media silence from Victoria had driven Alexander to desperation. He sat across from his best friend and lawyer, James Mitchell, who had been watching the tabloid coverage with growing concern. "Alexander, you need to think carefully about your next move," James said, spreading legal documents across his mahogany desk. "Your mother has made it clear that continuing this relationship will result in your complete disinheritance. No trust fund, no company shares, no family assets." Alexander ran his hands through his hair in frustration. "I don't care about the money, James. I care about Victoria." James leaned forward seriously. "It's not just about money. It's about power, influence, your entire future. Are you really prepared to walk away from everything?" Alexander stared out at the city skyline, seeing the hospital where Victoria worked in the distance. "What kind of life is it if I have everything but the person who makes it all meaningful?" he asked quietly. James joined him at the window. "A very lonely one," he admitted. "I've seen how you've changed since meeting her, Alexander. You're happier, more purposeful, but you need to understand what you're giving up." Alexander turned to face his friend with determination in his eyes. "Then help me figure out how to build something new. If I can't have my family's empire, I'll create my own." James raised an eyebrow. "You're serious about this?" Alexander nodded firmly. "Dead serious. I want to propose a business partnership." "I've been thinking about this for weeks," Alexander continued, pulling out a folder of documents he prepared. "A consulting firm focused on helping hospitals and medical facilities optimize their operations and funding. I know the business world, you know the legal framework, and together we can build something meaningful." James examined the business plan with growing interest. "This is actually brilliant, Alexander. You'd be using your connections and expertise to benefit exactly the kind of institutions Victoria works for." Alexander smiled for the first time in days. "Exactly. I want to build something she can be proud of, something that proves I'm more than just a trust fund heir." James began spreading contracts across the table. "Let's do it. I'm in." That evening, Alexander met his mother for what he knew would be their final confrontation as allies. Margaret sat in her usual spot at their exclusive restaurant, looking every inch the queen of high society that she'd always been. "Alexander, darling," she said coolly as he approached, "I trust you've come to your senses about this unfortunate publicity mess." Alexander remained standing, his posture formal and distant. "I've come to inform you of my decision, Mother. I'm renouncing my claim to the family inheritance." Margaret's composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine shock. "Don't be dramatic, darling. We both know you're not serious." Alexander pulled out a legal document and placed it on the table between them. Margaret read the renunciation papers with growing fury, her hands trembling slightly as she realized Alexander was absolutely serious. "You're throwing away everything your family has built for 3 generations, she hissed, her voice barely controlled. "For what? A nurse who probably won't even take you back after the media humiliation?" Alexander remained calm despite his mother's venom. "I'm not throwing anything away, Mother. I'm choosing to build my own legacy instead of inheriting one built on manipulation and control." Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "You ungrateful fool. You have no idea what you're sacrificing." Alexander met her furious gaze steadily. "I know exactly what I'm sacrificing, and I know exactly what I'm gaining." "This is your last chance, Alexander," Margaret said, playing her final card. "Walk away from this nurse, marry someone appropriate, and I'll pretend this rebellion never happened." Alexander shook his head with finality. The only person I want to marry is Victoria Matthews. With or without your approval. With or without the family fortune. Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. Then you're no son of mine, she declared loud enough for nearby diners to hear. Don't come crawling back when your little romance falls apart and you realize what you've lost. Alexander picked up the signed papers from the table. I want you to come back, Mother. I'm finally free to become the man I was meant to be. With that, he walked out of the restaurant and out of his mother's controlling influence forever. Alexander spent the next day putting his new life in order, liquidating his personal assets, and setting up the business partnership with James. By evening, he was standing outside Victoria's apartment building with a simple bouquet of daisies, her mother's favorite flowers, and no limousine in sight. He'd taken the subway for the first time in years, and despite everything he'd given up, he felt lighter than he had in months. This is who I really am, he thought as he looked up at Victoria's window. Not the heir to a fortune, just a man who loves a woman and wants to build something real with her. He took a deep breath and pressed the buzzer for her apartment. Helen answered the door and was surprised to see Alexander looking completely different from the confident businessman she'd met before. He seemed humbler, more vulnerable, carrying simple flowers instead of expensive gifts. Alexander, she said gently, Victoria isn't ready to see you yet. The media attention has been very hard on her. Alexander nodded, understanding. I know, Mrs. Matthews. That's actually why I'm here. I need you to know that I've made some changes, some decisions that I hope will prove how serious I am about your daughter. Helen studied his face carefully. What kind of changes? Alexander took a deep breath. I've given up my inheritance. I've started my own business. I'm no longer part of the world that hurt Victoria. Helen invited Alexander inside and listened as he explained his dramatic decision to break with his family and forge his own path. You gave up billions of dollars, she asked, hardly believing what she was hearing. For Victoria? Alexander shook his head. Not for Victoria. For myself. So I could become someone worthy of her love. So I could look at myself in the mirror and respect the man I see there. Helen was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what he'd done. That's either the most romantic gesture I've ever heard of, or the most foolish, she said finally. Alexander smiled sadly. Maybe both, but it's the only choice I could live with. Helen stood up and walked to Victoria's bedroom door. Victoria, she called softly. There's someone here you need to see. Victoria appeared in the doorway looking fragile but beautiful, her eyes red from crying but filled with surprise at seeing Alexander in her living room. Alexander, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What are you doing here? He stood slowly, the daisies trembling slightly in his hands. I came to tell you that I'm not the same man who let his mother hurt you. I came to prove that you're more important to me than any fortune, any inheritance, any family approval. Victoria's eyes filled with tears as she saw the sincerity in his face. You didn't need to prove anything, she said quietly. I never wanted your money. Alexander stepped closer carefully. I know. That's exactly why I had to give it all up. Because you deserve someone who chose love over legacy, someone who chose you over everything else. 2 weeks had passed since Alexander's dramatic gesture, and Victoria was slowly rebuilding her relationship with him based on who he truly was rather than his family's wealth. But their tentative happiness was shattered when Victoria received an urgent call at work. Victoria, you need to get to the cardiac unit immediately. Dr. Harrison's voice was grave over the hospital intercom. It's about your mother. Victoria's blood ran cold as she dropped everything and ran through the hospital corridors, her heart pounding with terror. Helen had been doing well lately, but Victoria knew that cancer treatments could cause sudden complications. Please let her be okay, she whispered as she reached the cardiac wing, seeing Alexander already waiting there with a stricken expression. What happened? Victoria asked desperately as Alexander pulled her into his arms. The doctor said her heart stopped during routine blood work, he explained, his voice tight with emotion. They managed to resuscitate her, but she needs emergency surgery that her insurance won't cover. The experimental treatments have put too much strain on her cardiovascular system. Victoria felt her world crashing down as she realized that all their progress, all of Helen's improvements, might be meaningless if they couldn't afford the surgery she needed to survive. How much? She asked, though she already knew the answer would be impossible. $400,000, Alexander said quietly. And it needs to happen within the next 6 hours, or we'll lose her. Victoria and Alexander sat in the hospital's financial office as the administrator explained their options with professional sympathy. Without insurance coverage, you would need to pay the full amount up front, she said gently. Victoria felt tears streaming down her face as she realized her mother might die simply because they couldn't afford to save her. There has to be something, she pleaded. Some payment plan, some program. The administrator shook her head sadly. I'm sorry, Miss Matthews. The cardiac surgical team requires guaranteed payment before they can proceed. Victoria looked at Alexander desperately, and she saw something change in his expression, a look of determination mixed with something that looked almost like relief. Actually, Alexander said quietly, there might be a way. But Victoria, I need to tell you something I should have told you months ago. Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder that Victoria had never seen before. Do you remember that first day, when I wrote something in my notebook after our accident? He asked gently. Victoria nodded, confused about why he was bringing this up now. I wasn't writing insurance information. I was writing instructions to my financial manager to set up a medical trust fund in your family's name. Victoria stared at him in shock. What are you talking about? Alexander opened the folder, revealing bank statements and legal documents. From the moment I met you, I knew I wanted to help. So I've been putting money aside every month, building a fund specifically for your mother's medical expenses. The administrator looked at the documents with growing amazement. The trust fund currently contains $800,000, Alexander continued, his voice gentle but firm. More than enough to cover this surgery and any future medical needs your mother might have. Victoria felt her knees go weak as the magnitude of what he was telling her sank in. You've been planning this since the day we met? She whispered. You've been secretly taking care of us for months? Alexander nodded, his eyes filled with love and vulnerability. I couldn't bear the thought of you suffering because of money when I had the power to help. But I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I could provide. So I kept it secret until you truly needed it. The administrator cleared her throat. Mr. Whitmore, this is highly unusual, but these documents appear to be completely legitimate. Victoria buried her face in her hands as the full picture of Alexander's love became clear. All this time, she sobbed. You were protecting us, planning for us, making sure we'd never have to suffer because of money. And I doubted you. I let your mother's words poison my mind against you. Alexander knelt beside her chair, taking her hands gently. You had every reason to doubt. My world is complicated, and my mother is ruthless. But this trust fund proves something that words never could. That from the very first moment I saw your strength and dignity, I knew I wanted to spend my life making sure nothing could ever hurt you or the people you love. The sincerity in his voice made Victoria's heart soar with joy and relief. As they walked toward the cardiac surgery unit where Helen would soon receive life-saving treatment, Victoria finally understood the depth of Alexander's planning and devotion. The notebook, the mysterious phone calls, all those times I thought you were being secretive, she said, pieces falling into place. You were coordinating this trust fund. Alexander squeezed her hand. I was also falling deeper in love with you every day and trying not to overwhelm you with the intensity of what I was feeling. Victoria stopped walking and turned to face him. I love you, she said, the words carrying all the certainty and trust that had been missing from their relationship. I love you completely, without reservation, without fear. Alexander's face lit up with joy. Even knowing that loving me means dealing with my impossible family? Your family doesn't define you, Victoria said firmly. This trust fund, your sacrifice of the inheritance, the way you've loved my mother as your own, that's who you really are. Alexander held her close, both of them crying tears of relief and joy. I have something else to tell you, he whispered against her ear. When I renounce my inheritance, I kept one thing, my grandmother's engagement ring. She was the only person in my family who ever taught me what real love looked like. Victoria pulled back to look at his face, her heart pounding with anticipation. Alexander, she breathed. He smiled through his tears. Victoria Matthews, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that love really can conquer anything? 6 hours later, Helen woke up in the cardiac recovery unit to find Victoria and Alexander sitting beside her bed, both glowing with happiness. Victoria was wearing a simple but beautiful engagement ring that caught the hospital room's fluorescent light. The surgery was completely successful, Mom, Victoria said, squeezing her mother's hand. And we have some wonderful news to share with you. Helen looked between them and smiled weakly but joyfully. I can see it in your faces, she whispered. You found your way back to each other. Alexander leaned forward to kiss Helen's forehead gently. Actually, Mrs. Matthews, we never lost each other. We just needed to learn to trust what we had. Helen's eyes filled with happy tears as she realized that her family was not only surviving, but thriving with love. As Victoria sat with her recovering mother and her fiancé, she marveled at how love had truly conquered every obstacle thrown in their path. Alexander's secret trust fund had been the ultimate proof that real love isn't about grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. It's about quiet, consistent care and planning for the people you cherish most. Sometimes, Victoria thought as she looked at the two people she loved most in the world, the greatest love stories aren't about choosing between love and family. They're about love creating family. Their wedding would be simple, held in the hospital chapel where Helen could attend, officiated by the same chaplain who had prayed over Helen's surgery. And Margaret Whitmore, upon learning of the engagement through the newspaper, would quietly establish a scholarship fund for nursing students, perhaps finally understanding that some battles aren't worth winning. Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey of love, trust, and the power of true commitment. What did you think of Alexander's secret plan that he'd been working on since day one? Did you see that twist coming? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Give this story a like if it touched your heart. Subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss our amazing stories that prove love really can overcome any obstacle. Follow us for more incredible stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Remember, the greatest love stories are the ones where people choose each other every single day, through every challenge life throws at them.